to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Morgan Lewin. I am one of the moderators over Ask Historians, writing under the username aquatermain, usually writing about musicological stuff or Argentinian and South American native issues. Joining me today is Elle Ransom, one of our longtime contributors writing about indigenous issues and anthropological issues in Ask Historians. Welcome, Elle. It's very good to have you.
Oh, thank you, Morgan, so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we are going to be talking about an issue that we touched upon on Ask Historians last year, and we have touched upon several times over in the last few months, which are residential schools in North America, particularly in the United States and in Canada. To start us off, I would like to ask you if you could give us a little bit of context about why exactly we're talking about these issues right now. And particularly, why is it important for us to be talking about this now?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So if you are like most Canadians, and I assume some Americans as well, you did not grow up learning about the residential school system. And so this was kind of just jumped into the news last year for most people around the summer when there were news reports of the cemeteries being found at residential schools in Canada. And then this year, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, directed that department to coordinate an investigation into the U.S. federal Indian boarding school system. That publication was released this summer. So if you're seeing more things in the news right now, the reason is that's the reason. The background is that this has been a long push from indigenous communities, both in Canada and the United States, for recognition of the harms from the boarding school system. Very briefly, what happened was the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, and part of the stipulations from that agreement was the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So from 2007 to 2015, the Canadian government spent a significant amount of money to go around the country and interview more than 6,000 witnesses and survivors from the residential schools. That birthed a 6-volume report which detailed a lot of the crimes, conditions, situations that Indigenous students were put through. And then it established a National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Part of that payment was also meant to be devoted to investigating marked and unmarked cemeteries at the schools. So we knew there was a little bit of, because of soil erosion and because of future construction, there were remains discovered at these former schools, but there was never a widespread investigation. And so that's what happened last year, was the first preliminary ground penetrating radar surveys were starting to come back. And that's where you start seeing the news reports at Brandon or Maryville or Cranbrook or Cooper Island, where we find these unmarked graves. And that was a huge bit of the news last summer. Is it just seemed like this horrible toll of every week we were getting news reports from another school. In the midst of this push last year with these news reports coming out from Canada, Secretary Haaland commissioned the federal boarding school report, which was published this year. And so this is just the first volume. The idea is that it's taking a reckoning of the schools in the U.S. And so what the criteria they're looking at is schools that provided overnight housing, schools that provided an academic or vocational training. They needed to have received federal funds, and they were operating before 1969. So that's why we're seeing this happen now. And sometimes I feel like we just get these little blips of stuff in the news and we don't quite know why, but it's been a long-term process from indigenous communities to get recognition and get an accounting of what was actually happening with these schools both in the U.S. and Canada. So it doesn't just emerge on your newsfeed fully formed. It was a result of a lot of back and forth between indigenous populations in Canada and the United States and the respective governments.
I think that it's particularly interesting that we are talking about these issues now because we have been looking at a lot of very different social justice movements in North America, but not just in North America, uh, just in general in the continent and also in Europe and in other parts of the world that have been looking at a lot of historical developments in the last maybe 150, 180 years, and have been looking for this idea of truth, right? This idea of truth, this idea of in this particular case, this idea of truth and reconciliation as one, uh, as two parts of the same concept or the same fight, in a way. And I think that it's interesting to think about this particular issue of the residential schools as part of a specific context, right? As part of a wider, systematic, and more general program and planning by the state. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, one pitfall that I see in a lot of the reporting that's going on about the residential schools is the idea that these were an independent, exclusive sort of thing that just rose up and somebody had an idea. Usually Richard Henry Pratt is blamed for that, of having residential schools forcibly taking kids away from their parents, putting them in these schools for assimilation. That narrative, while true, elements of it are true, is not the best way to understand the boarding schools in context. And it doesn't help us understand how the U.S. as a country and the population that was not indigenous allowed this to happen. So from the beginning of the Republic, U.S. indigenous policy was essentially a land policy and an acculturation policy. And the background, that was kind of the carrot, and then the stick was the ever-present threat of genocidal violence against indigenous communities that didn't follow through with this. So as originally envisioned, U.S. Indian policy treated indigenous nations as nations, but they weren't fully independent. Their sovereignty is limited by the U.S. government under the whims of the U.S. government. And the vision was that that autonomy was going to gradually decrease as the U.S. grew. So as indigenous nations gave up their land, either by sale or by force, which really is sometimes amounts to exactly the same thing, right? When you're threatened with, extinction, then through those means you were going to break up the tribal system, you were going to break up the hold on the land, and there's going to be no room for indigenous peoples. They're going to be replaced by white farmers. So part of that civilization approach was, okay, take up the communal holding of land, replace it with individual land use patterns, individual holding, teach them agriculture or husbandry, which just ignores any of the previous indigenous lifeways that were already based on either full-fledged agriculture or partial agricultural land use policies, and then substitute this very Northern European version of life. I know you're from Argentina, and so one of the similarities that I've seen is how, at least in the northern borderlands of the Spanish Empire, the missions were doing a similar thing, right? They were reducing the population onto a mission, instituting a new language with Spanish, introducing a new religion with Catholicism, and a new life way with, hey, now you're going to help support us with the missions. So in that sense, it wasn't new. It was a policy that was in place because it was cheaper. Spain did it because it was less expensive to subsidize missions and have the church put those missions down than it was to hold a standing army on the borderlands. Same thing with the U.S. It was much cheaper, and you see that running throughout letters going back and forth between different founding fathers and stuff, that it was much cheaper to do this acculturation and land policy than try to gain military victory. So beginning in the early 1800s, the U.S. Congress is authorizing $15,000 annually for these promotions of civilization training among Franklin Indians, and they upped that in 1819 to $10,000 annually. So dedicating which for a new republic is a lot of money, and they're dedicating that with the intent that it's part of warfare against indigenous peoples, because before 1849, the Office of Indian Affairs in the U.S. government was under the War Department. It wasn't moved to the Department of the Interior until after 1849, so very much so these were decisions being made by military personnel for military reasons. It is also helpful to know that people involved with the system interpreted their role as fighting, right? So Richard Henry Pratt was a cavalry officer who's also the first superintendent Carlisle, and one of the originators of this off-reservation boarding school idea. He was prone to outbursts and everything, so that'll put that a little bit in context with this. But when he was setting up Carlisle, he contacted a superior officer, General William Sherman, and asked for another officer to come help, and Sherman denied him. And so Pratt, in a fit of rage, wrote off to the president saying, and this is a direct quote from Pratt's letter, is that I'm at this time fighting a greater number of enemies of civilization than the whole of my regiment put together, and I know further that I am fighting them with 1,000 times more hope of success. End quote. He's envisioning his role still as a warrior. He was a cavalry officer before, he was still military, and he's still envisioning this as a continuation of an Indian fight as a superintendent of a school.
I didn't know that. That is that is intense, to say the least.
I mean, he's subject to hyperbole. He's a very ego German guy, and he's writing to the president, and he's probably psyching himself up a little bit, but still, there's a nugget of truth in that.
No, absolutely, but I think it's it sheds some light into the general zeitgeist, this general conceptualization of what needed to be done, right? Like we were saying earlier, this systematization of genocidal policies and practices. That it's interesting that you bring up how the Spanish worked, because in the case of the Spanish, in the case of the Spanish missions, which there were Spanish missions essentially everywhere in the viceroyalties, even here in Argentina, in the southernmost parts of where the viceroyalties ended, halfway into what is now Argentina, we still have ruins of Jesuitic missions that were, of course, abandoned after the Jesuits were expelled initially. But the concept and the idea was so very aggressively tied to evangelization first, acculturization second, because evangelization to the Spanish Empire was, and Catholicism in general, was beyond just culture. It was a political mandate. They had a political mandate to be the ones to bring Catholicism to native populations. But after the empire disappeared, after all the revolutions and all the independence movements in Latin America, we don't really see a continuation of this concept of creating these specific institutions to teach and to civilize, as you were mentioning, indigenous populations. Particularly here in Argentina, following the civil wars period in the mid 1800s, once the country was fully settled and unified after the civil wars were over in the 1860s and 70s, when what we call the conquest of the desert started, which is the process for those listening who may not be familiar, it was the process of the Argentinian state expanding southwards into indigenous controlled territories, into Patagonia. The idea was simply to expand the territory, like you were saying. It was a land-based policy first, but everyone who was captured was eventually sold into slavery. I mean, slavery was technically illegal, of course, per the Constitution, but, well, we know very well that constitutions are all well and good, but they don't necessarily apply in every part of the country, especially in the early days of these republics. And the idea of how this assimilation, this cultural assimilation, and this acculturation happened here in Argentina is very different. And when we were preparing and researching the piece that AskHistorians put out last year about this, to which you contributed, I found it very interesting because I didn't really know much. I knew residential schools existed, but I didn't really understand all that much about the system or how it was implemented. Because again, it is very different from here. My ancestors were sold into slavery. Others eventually, their children eventually went to school, but they went to regular schools because they were physically assimilated. They were forced to become Argentinian citizens. There was no such thing as a residential school. And I think it's very interesting in this particular context because, of course, there is a very, very important difference in how early colonization happened. The Spanish had essentially no issue mingling, as they said, with natives. They didn't really care. That's why most people in Latin America are indigenous descendants, even if they know it or not. Regardless of that, to a degree, most people here in Latin America are descended from indigenous peoples. So I think it's particularly interesting in this case that it is such a complex system.
Sure.
And I would like to ask if you could just give us a little bit of context about how exactly it worked. How did life in a residential school happen? And in particular, something that we brought up in the post and that we talked about briefly before we started this recording, this idea that there was agency within these places. The people who were at these schools, the indigenous people who were subjected to the system, had agency, and they managed to find spaces of resistance. So I would like to ask about that.
Sure. One thing that I thought was right on the nose that you were talking about was the idea of evangelical necessity propelling the Catholic response. And it's not a religious evangelical necessity, but the schools were very much, especially in the late 1800s, part and parcel of this American evangelical belief of this manifest destiny and progress across the country, that we are going to unify this continent under one nation. It's going to be sea to sea. There's a narrative of indigenous populations just vanishing and into the sea, basically. So yeah, the belief and fervor that the Spanish fathers carried with them is in their belief in their own righteousness is very similar to the progressive era American belief in their own righteousness and necessity that this has to happen. So it's very apropos that you said that, and I think it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it is helpful to understand the collective culture at the time that allowed this to happen. So if your belief that you are the best as far as the height of any civilization, that you're doing a good thing by taking kids away from their parents because you're going to endow in them the traits and qualities that you see as superior to them, that's very much the same mindset. It is, yeah. So that was what was fueling it, and I think it's important to realize that this was a whole cultural thing, right? It's not just these couple people were bad actors. This was a whole nation that believed this was okay and supported it. And some of the intelligentsia in the late 1800s, some of the best authors, like some of our most celebrated authors at the time, Harry Beecher Stowe, a lot of other famous intelligentsia were totally on board with this. They thought this was the compassionate way, right? Because on the other hand, you have people like Teddy Roosevelt, who's quoted in 1886 as basically saying the only good Indians are dead, right? So that's the other thing. They thought they were being compassionate because they weren't just killing everyone. That was the other alternative to them, was okay, we either kill them all or we figure out a way that they can live as white people. So getting to what you were saying about how this worked, it's helpful to continue the idea of interpreting this as an act of war, especially for the first couple generations to go through the boarding school system. So the U.S. demanded that indigenous children start attending these schools. So there were over 150 treaties that were already established treaties between the U.S. and indigenous nations, and part of the requirement of those treaties were things like having provisions and annuities that were guaranteed, because the U.S. said, okay, well, you can't have all your land. You're going to go into a smaller area, parcel of land. Indigenous people were like, okay, of course, we can't live on that. And so the U.S. said, okay, well, we'll give you these provisions every year. They, of course, end up being quite horrible, but they were a lifeline. By 1893, Congress is authorizing the Secretary of the Interior to withhold those. So basically, the lifeline that the U.S. gave to reservation land that was not fertile and you were not able to make a living on it, that was going to be taken away if you didn't send your kids to school. And then in the late 1880s, you start seeing these forcible roundups of children. So actually going on to sovereign land, going on to indigenous land, and rounding up the kids. So there's just a report from the Mescalero Apache agent, which I think is helpful just to kind of see how they were thinking about it at the time. So, quote, he says, "Everything in the way of persuasion and argument having failed, it became necessary to visit the camps unexpectedly with a detachment of police and seize such children as were proper and take them away to school willingly or unwillingly. Some hurried their children off to the mountains or hid them away in camp, and the police had to chase and capture them like so many wild rabbits. This unusual proceeding created quite an outcry, and the men were sullen and muttering, and the women loud in their lamentations, and the children almost out of their wits with fright." So, end quote. So this is happening all over the place. So you have indigenous families developing games that they can tell their kids that are like hide and seek, but really it's, I know the roundup is coming. How do I teach my kid the best way to hide, right? And so they would send them off to the mountains or send them out to the boonies, basically, if they were, sometimes the kids knew, sometimes they didn't, why they were going, but they would send them out on errands when they knew the sweep was coming, or just teach them how to hide really well and hope to avoid the sweep. At least in several instances, the 10th Cavalry, which was the Buffalo Soldiers Regiment, was sent in to round up in the Hopi land, round up kids. So it was a very intentional, it was police, it was military, it wasn't just, hey, send your kids to school. It was backed up by force. When the Hopi refused to give their kids over to the roundup, a group of men were actually imprisoned in Alcatraz for several years because they said, well, we volunteer for tribute, basically, like, you're not going to take your kids, you can take us. And so they said, okay, fine, and they were shipped off to Alcatraz. So the idea is, yes, this was very much a forceful thing and a very much a dramatic thing, right? It's also helpful to read some of those survivor stories from the very beginning to see how they interpreted what was going on, right? Like, how did a kid that was taken away to school, what did they feel like? So Luther Standing Bear is one of the best sources for what that first group at Carlisle was like, right? And I think we did part of this quote on our write-up earlier. He was saying, he wrote later, quote, "I could think of no other reason why white people wanted Indian boys and girls except to kill them, and not having the remotest idea of what a school was, I thought we were going east to die. In giving myself up to go east, I was proving to my father that he was honored with a brave son," end quote. And so even in the midst of like terrifying reality, right? Like, this is a hostile nation that's stealing you. Standing Bear was still finding some agency in that and saying, okay, well, this is not completely outside the realm of my understanding. I can be brave now, and I can show my nation that I'm going to be brave, and I'm going to honor them and go east, even if I think I'm going to die. And so that it was helpful to think about how the kids interpreted it, at least how they think they interpreted it later on, right? We can discuss how memories change over time, but he definitely interpreted it as he describes it at one point of the crowds looking on him like the conquerors looking upon the conquered, right? That was very much his interpretation. Other parents, so Charles Eastman is a one of the first generations, and he reports later that his dad told him, "We have now entered upon this new life, and there's no going back. It's the same as if I set you on your first warpath. I shall expect you to conquer." Right? Like that's their interpretation of what to do. We can't avoid it. I want you to go conquer. Right? Luther standing there thinking, I can't avoid it. I'm going to go bravely. Right? So still taking some of that initiative to it. Then do you think it's useful at this point to talk a little bit about what the school was like and arrival at school and what the conditions were like? I've been studying this for so long that sometimes I forget what people know and don't know.
No, I think it would be useful. I think a lot, like you were saying, I think a lot of people don't really know exactly what went on at these schools. So I think it will be useful. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so especially for those first generations, it was a completely new experience, right? Later generations would have heard from their parents or from the uncles or from the older brothers and sisters about what was going on, but this was very traumatic for the first couple generations. So you arrive at school, all your clothes and pretty much anything you brought from home is confiscated and destroyed, and it's replaced by a school uniform that's modeled on a very military style. So it takes out any sort of individual variation, right? You're just in this homogenous sea of students. Repeatedly, one of the most traumatic experiences is cutting hair. In the U.S. perspective, long hair was a remnant of savagery, so needed to cut the hair to look a little bit more like the European style. For those who don't know, in many indigenous communities in the U.S., you only cut your hair when you're in deep, deep mourning. It's like it's a response to the death of a close family member, and it's a sign to everyone in the community that you're mourning the loss of a loved one. So it was an intensely traumatic experience for these kids who were removed from their family. They think they're going to die, basically, and they have no idea what's going on with their family back home. And then the cultural message of, okay, we're cutting your hair now, right, was a huge severance and a huge cause of stress. Then also any indigenous names were replaced with anglicized names. So with all the trauma that's associated with that, right? Like you're taking your name, which anchors you in your community and anchors you as connections to other people. And Luther Standingbeard says he basically just took a pointer and pointed to a blackboard before he even knew how to read or write, and that was his name. There was a list of names, and he just pointed to something, and that's what they started calling him. So it's just this complete disconnect from any previous lifeways. And then the teaching starts, right? So then you got to try to learn a new language without interpreters, and you got to learn to read and to write in English. That was the first half of the day, and then usually the second half of the day was reserved for some kind of industrial or agricultural training that could vary greatly between schools. So for the boys, it's usually agriculture, tinsmithing, harness making, cart making, things like that, something that was geared to be able to help them either tend to land or enter into the wage market. Then for girls, it was more sewing, cooking, laundry classes, things like that, to prepare them for what was deemed acceptable, progressive era jobs for women. And the labor of the students allowed the schools to function, right? So they are producing the food that allows the school to function. Their carpentry classes are repairing school buildings, right? So they don't have to pay another laborer to come in. They can just teach the kids the carpentry needed to repair the school. The girls were washing the uniforms, so they didn't have to pay for outside laundry services. The schools that was part of it. So in a very real sense, they're violating child labor law across the country as for just navigating these schools and to be able to support it. And so a lot of the kids will report later on that they were exhausted. That's one of the deepest memories of school, is just the bone-wearing tiredness that they were feeling, because they were in this completely different setting that was strictly regimented. They had to march in between classes and respond to a bell, and then they're being indoctrinated with not only English, but a very Whiggish version of history where it's deeply different than their interpretation of how, and their family's interpretation of what happened. And then they got to go to, shop class. And then there's, all the other errands and stuff, and they have minimal time for themselves. And the survivors report just being exhausted and collapsing in their bed at the end of the day. One of the other issues was the creation of an unhealthy environment, and I mentioned this in the conference presentation, is that there was an either overt or covert means to create an environment that wasn't exactly healthy for these students. So the superintendents were paid per capita to run the school, so they would intentionally try to increase the number of students that could come in. This led to just jamming the dorm rooms full of students, a couple students sleeping to a bed, putting students out on porches to sleep at night, which, it's not bad all the time, but when you're in the Midwest in the winter, it was terrifyingly cold. And then it created the environment. And of course, if you're trying to save costs, you're not getting the best food, you're not providing the best sanitary practices. There's, one washcloth for 5 or 10 kids, not really good bathroom facilities, if they even had indoor plumbing at all. A lot of the schools, they were using chamber pots, and long after they needed to have transitions. So you create an environment where you have stressed out hosts, where you've packed them together so densely that diseases can spread, and then you don't provide the resources for them to get better. So that's how diseases like tuberculosis just became rampant in these schools. And essentially why we have even talking about cemeteries in the first place, because it was an unhealthy environment for the students. Just as an example, the Shoshone and the Arapaho between 1881 and 1894 sent 73 students to boarding schools, and only 26 survived. It was just an insane amount of, especially in the early years, of really high mortality. By 1900, there's kind of an understanding that these schools are incredibly unhealthy. Not in a small part due to indigenous families writing repeatedly to superintendents and to their local, their state, and their federal representatives and telling them that it was an unhealthy environment. By, I think, 1899, there's a report to the Secretary of the Interior, and, quote, the word murder is a terrible word, but we are a little less than murderers if we follow this course we are now following. After the attention of those in charge have been called to its fatal results, hundreds of boys and girls are sent home to die, end quote. It was known by 1900 that these were deeply unsafe conditions, and that something needed to change.
So another thing that I wanted to ask you about is this idea that we've discussed before of how complex the system was and how complex the interactions between indigenous peoples and the government and just the general white population of the U.S. in general was when it came to these particular issues. So can we touch a little bit upon that, about this complexity and these spaces of resistance?
Yeah, so great. I think it's vital that we get this. So again, another pitfall that I was seeing in some of the media representations of what was going on is very much, and you know this because you talk about indigenous stuff all the time, Morgan, that indigenous history, that there's this common narrative of white or European action and indigenous reaction, right? You constantly force, this narrative constantly forces indigenous peoples into reactionary roles instead of putting them in the driver's seat and having their agency and autonomy that we talked about earlier, right? So that has been lost a lot with the story of the boarding schools. And Brenda Child is a Ojibwe, she's Red Lake Ojibwe historian, and she dove into a volume of letters that were sent mostly from the Ojibwe, but other nations in the in the Greater Plains, looking at the letters that were sent from families to students, families to superintendents, families to the government, advocating and for themselves and for their kids and for better conditions, right? It wasn't just this passive acceptance, and especially after the shock of the first generation, right? Now you have a generation that survived the schools, graduated, some just aged out, who are now armed with the tools that, the schools gave them, right? They can understand, they're fluently able to converse in English. They know how to write persuasively, and they were using those skills to transform the system. So Child wrote what I think is a really important quote to remember is, and here I'll start it, quote, "Among American Indians today who often single out the boarding school system as the institution responsible for creating societal problems for later generations, there's not a strong historical memory of the notion that Indian people themselves repeatedly sought out the schools for their children as a strategy of family preservation." End quote. And so what we want to get into is how, by transforming the system, they were able to use it for families to stay connected, for families to survive, especially during horrible economic conditions, whether that was on the reservation specifically, or if that was in general, like during the Great Depression in the United States. If families were having a hard time being able to support and care for their children, the schools were a way to make sure that they survived, a way to give them the skills needed to be able to survive that later. So you have letters from parents. Like there was a single, in 1924, there's a single mother she worked in St. Paul, and she was sending a letter to the school superintendent at Flandreau, which is one of the schools in the upper Midwest, and saying that, she says, quote, "I have had the sole support of my 3 boys for the last 6 years. I've had to care and work for them while they were small, but I'm just like an old mother bear, and I'm going to fight for my children. I'm really proud of the work that they're doing in the school this year." And so sending her, end quote, sending her students, her kids to school was a way that she could take care of them because she had no other option. At that point, she saw no other option. But also, you start seeing parents lobbying to get kids into certain schools based on what they want to do, and even students advocating for themselves and before they became students, like writing to the superintendents, writing to the heads of the different departments to see if that would be a good place for them. So they were trying to figure out, okay, I have to go, but where do I want to go, right? And if this school exists, can we get them in the best possible scenario? And then can we advocate for them? If they're not living up to the promises that they made, we're going to bring the wrath of whatever we can muster onto them, right? What this manifests as is by 1914, Carlisle had, even though it was the flagship institution in the States, it had kind of fallen into disrepair. Pratt was long gone. It was taken over by just other, governmental lackeys that weren't really doing a very good job. And by 1914, the students had an expectation that the schools would serve them, right? So over 200 students from Carlisle signed a petition demanding a congressional investigation of the school. And just one of the litany of the items that they brought up in the investigation was how Carlisle promised education and workplace training in certain specific departments like surveying and dictation, and then just ignored that and didn't have those departments anymore. So students are actively choosing where they want to go based on the education opportunities offered. When they're not offered, they're taking it to the top to say, come in and investigate this because you're not living up to your promises anymore. Students at Haskell, which was a school in Kansas, did a similar thing. And so they're constantly advocating for themselves to try to figure out how to use what is available to them. Now that's the kind of, that's the professional level of agency and fighting back, right? The undercurrent is always this tension between what the demand is placed on and what the rebellion kind of looks like, right? And how to turn against harsher conditions. And so runaways were incredibly common. If the school was being oppressive in any sense, kids just simply ran away. In Carlisle in 1913, they'd had 140 students run away just in one school year. So that's like roughly once a week somebody was just gone. In schools that were closer to the reservations or to enclaves of indigenous families, the parents had no problem just hiding kids out for a while the police came looking for them, because they were trusting that the kids were responding to an environment that wasn't suited for them, right? And so the best way to do that was just like, yep, no, we don't know where they are. They probably went over that way all the while they're hiding in the back. Then there's slightly more violent ways of rebelling when things just got too much. So at Haskell, there was an out-and-out rebellion. Like, they tried to take over the school. There was a assembly one afternoon, and so the students cut power to the school, rang the school bell, started smashing lights, and there was even threats at one point that they were going to lynch the superintendent. Like, he testified later that he heard them say "string him up" when they found him as he was running for his life. So there were active acts of rebellion, and then there were more covert acts of, okay, well, we know the English only rule, but they called it speaking Indian. We're going to speak Indian after lights out. Or we're going to, run out and meet a romantic partner, or we're going to go hang with the boys and, like kids, experiment with alcohol or psychotropic substances of some sort. But they're finding those ways to be human in the middle of an oppressive system. And I think we learned so much from those actions of autonomy about what they value, right? Sometimes it's just breaking into the kitchen and getting extra food because they're hungry. Sometimes it's setting fire to the school because the situation has gotten that bad. We lose a lot of that if we just have this narrative of, okay, white people did this, indigenous people responded. We lose how people navigated the system and chose or chose not to do certain things, right? Chose or chose not to respond or incorporate that belief system. And that's one of the things I hope going forward with the subsequent volumes that the boarding school initiative is going to come up with, that we don't lose sight of, right? It doesn't just become this grim tally of marked and unmarked graves, right? But it becomes a story of, okay, yes, there was death, but there's also life, right? There's also people that are still alive who went through the system, people whose parents and grandparents went through the system, and we're still working through the repercussions of that in a very real sense. The Running Bear studies that were compiled by the National Institutes of Health are still looking at the downstream effects and health-wise of boarding school survivors having dramatically increased rates of diabetes, tuberculosis, cancer, things like that. Like, we're still living with the repercussions, and it's important I believe it's important to keep those stories of the life in the system, as well as the specter of death that was holding over the schools at the time.
So I do agree that it is very important for us to be able to recognize just how much of this history is still very much alive, how much this has impacted the lives of people who are still here, or people who are immediately descended from people who went through the system not a long time ago. And one thing that does come to my mind after talking about this spaces of resistance against this particular system, especially when it comes to petitioning the government, is how exactly, if at all, did the governments of the United States and Canada react to these petitions and to this? Did they acknowledge what was going on before everything? Because right now we know that both governments and both countries are trying to establish governmental institutions and different means of dealing with this, like you were mentioning, these reports and these commissions. Mm-hmm. But at the time and during the duration of maybe, I don't know, the 20th century, for example, was there an actual response from the government to try and better the conditions of this institution?
Sure. Yeah, so the one-word response is sluggish, right? They're never going to voluntarily do this with speed. Yes, so I know less about what was going on in Canada. In the U.S., what happens is you have that petition from Haskell for a congressional investigation, and then 2 years later, I think it was 2 years later, you have a similar petition from Carlisle, from the actual students, saying, come here and investigate this. And there was at Carlisle, I'm less familiar with Haskell, but at Carlisle there was a wide variety of things that were going on. There was rampant physical abuse. There was, like we mentioned before, just flat out lying about the opportunities the school provided. Nutrition was awful. So that opened, and because Carlisle was so in proximity close to DC, they were under the microscope a little bit more. So that prompted a study called the Merriam Report. And again, sluggish, it took a while to get there, but so surveyors went across the country looking for evidence of anything that was going on in the boarding schools, anything that was going on in Indian country all across the nation, and came back with this completely damning report about how bad conditions were. And it was published in the 1920s. And that was eye-opening for a lot of people who didn't have a personal connection to either life in Indian country or in the schools themselves. That brought a huge call for reform. So, they looked at how much per capita were being paid for kids to have for food, right? And it was abysmal. It was like a third of what they needed, right? The sanitation was terrible. The resources were terrible. The schooling, there's no codified lesson planning. It was just pretty much, hey, whoever shows up to teach, we're going to let them teach, right? If there were elements of abuse, they kind of, unfortunately, very similar to our modern setting where we have abusers in a oppressive system that are just shuttled around instead of actively kicked out of the system. So they would be shuffled from school to school. So all these things came out, and there was a big transformation of, again, sluggish, but transformation of the system. That took, a lifetime of advocacy from indigenous families to get there. And then after the Merriam Report, you see a transformation, and the school is not quick and not anywhere near as wholesale as it needed to be, but still an effort to revive the schools so that by the 20s and 30s and 40s, what you're having is a generation of kids now who are coming through who they've been to a residential day school. They already know English. They've already heard from their parents or their uncles or their older brothers and sisters about what's going to happen in school. So it's not as traumatic. It's still traumatic. They're still, away from home, and you get homesick and you still have to work really hard and all that stuff. But it's not as overtly warfare as it was in the beginning. And then that generation of students, we see more of the elements of being able to enjoy school time a little bit more. Now, granted they say it's not the classes. It's more the making friends. It's more being able to kick some butt on the playing fields. It's more learning an instrument. It's more having access to a lot of things that they just didn't have access to at home. So there's an element of actually enjoying the experience by the middle part of the century because of this tireless advocacy, right? So yes, the U.S. responded. It's never fast, and it's never complete. And I don't want to give too much credit for a genocidal system for responding to say, oh, sorry, our bad. We didn't genocide hard enough because you're still here. So let's say, yeah, there were attempts. And I always try to remember on these stories of the past that famous phrase, nobody's the villain in their own story. These weren't mustachioed bad guys that we would be identifiable as bad guys walking down the street. In many cases, it was people that thought they were acting out of compassion, and were completely horror struck. Like there are, letters from these bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young teachers that would go out west and want to teach in a reservation school and just be horrified by the conditions and horrified by their lack of ability to take care and change anything in the system. So you have people that are trying, that, they're got their own indoctrination that they're the best in this progressive era idea of we're going to triumph and technology is going to triumph over barbarism and it's going to be awesome. And they're personally thinking they're operating under compassion. And then you have, the people that are just trying to get a paycheck, but they're not actively trying to make life horrible. Yeah, I mean, the subset of abusers is probably fairly small, but it's all operating in the system that gained this energy and then became a snowball effect of going throughout the indigenous populations in both Canada and the U.S. So that's important to remember, the human aspect of it, because as you mentioned at the top of the podcast, there's a lot of racial justice talk going on right now. And if we don't want to fall into a lot of those similar, mistakes, we need to learn that, okay, we really need to listen, right? And indigenous families and communities have been fighting this fight for centuries. You might be cool to learn about it today or yesterday, but starting from a place of being willing to listen is vitally important.
I agree completely. One of the things that we were talking about before we started the recording is doing these comparisons is always difficult, and this generalization is always difficult because there is such a level of complexity to these kinds of genocidal systems. But I think that it's interesting and it's important to remember that yes, we shouldn't romanticize what the governments of our respective countries have or have not done to address these issues, but the fact that there have been some steps taken towards some kind of truth, some kind of reconciliation is always important. Very, very recently, only a couple of weeks ago here in Argentina, there was a very important federal ruling by a federal judge that sets a fascinating and very useful precedent moving forward. Because in 1924 in northern Argentina, there was a very violent massacre of indigenous peoples against the Qom people in particular in Chaco province, in which around between 400 and 700 people were killed following a strike. These indigenous people lived in a community that had been built around a cotton factory, and they lived in and worked in essentially they were basically slaves and way into the 1920s, and they decided to strike, and well, the police and just the land-owning oligarchy, they essentially killed most of them. They massacred entire families there, and the issue remained unresolved for almost 100 years. But finally, 98 years after the fact, a federal judge ruled that the crimes against humanity that were committed by the state in that particular instance were not only crimes against humanity, but they were also part of a genocidal plan to exterminate indigenous populations or to assimilate indigenous populations. And this idea, and it's something that usually comes up when we talk about genocide against indigenous populations in AskHistorians, and when we talk about in academia in general, there's a lot of people who are either reticent or they outright deny the possibility of using the concept genocide retroactively to talk about these things. Because, well, they hide behind the fact that the Genocide Convention was in 1948, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's very interesting that we can still see today, thanks to, again, it very much in this particular case, this ruling came after almost 100 years of the families of these people fighting and petitioning the state and petitioning the justice system for the truth to come out, for some kind of reckoning to be had when it came to the state and to actual police officers perpetrating these crimes. And the fact that this was achieved after so long is very important. It's very it's key, and it's very helpful for us to be able to continue this very important work, which is something that still needs to be done all over the continent. This isn't over, right? This, like we were saying earlier, this is something that is still very much alive, both in the recent memory of the people who went through the system, in the daily lives of the people who are still alive. So I think that maybe one last question before we wrap up would be, what now? What's in the future?
Sure.
What can we look forward to when it comes to this particular situation?
Sure. So in both, Canada's a little ahead of us. So there's going to be more ground penetrating radar surveys. There's going to be more discussion with survivors, and more of this is going to come out, more of these stories. The U.S., hopefully, I'm hopeful this is going to happen, but it seems like there's enough momentum now that there are going to be more volumes for the boarding school initiative. This was just the first volume that listed the schools, that showed their location, and the document is quite accessible for people who don't, even people who don't have much of a history with this. So it's publicly available, and I'll make sure I link it on the Ask Historians page when we do this. That they want people, that it's very intentional with the way they wrote this document, to put it in context, to put the schools in context, and to understand how this is a deep history of the U.S., right? So the next volumes are going to build on that foundation, and it's going to be tough, right? It's going to be really challenging for people to understand that there were over 400 some odd, 408 or so residential schools in the United States. Of the 19 that we've investigated already, we have a reasonable assumption that there are 500 burials at these schools, and that might be a bit of an undercount. So that number is going to grow exponentially, right? These stories, hopefully, if it mirrors what's happening in Canada, there's going to be a similar kind of truth reconciliation discussion where survivor stories are coming out. And that's going to be tough, right? Because you're going to hear the good and the bad, but it's going to be a lot of heartbreaking discussion of the abuse of the system that was ignored for far, far too long. So we're going to hear more reports of this X number of marked or unmarked graves. There's going to be attempts at repatriating those remains, excavation, and if the indigenous nations request it, some cultures don't want to disinter remains, and some cultures want them back, so it's hard to do a generalization. There's going to be a disinterment and a reinternment and bringing these students back home. That's already happening at Carlisle. Carlisle has done an amazing job. The Carlisle Digital Resource Center has done an amazing job of putting all these documents up so you can see what was going on with the school. They've digitized everything, but they're also working with the families to repatriate the remains. So there's going to be stories of these kids coming back home, right, and being reburied with their people. Only because I cut my teeth on indigenous history with a lot of the discussion of post-contact, like disease spread, and a lot of that argument gets lost we get lost in the weeds by arguing numbers, right? So my sincerest hope is that as we move forward, we're not just distracted by the numbers. We're not just trying to create this toll of was the U.S. worse? Was Canada worse? Was, Oklahoma worse? Was whatever. Don't just focus on the numbers. Focus on the communities that were affected by this. Focus on the families of the survivors and those who didn't survive. And then listen to those stories. That's what I talked about earlier, about just listen to what they're saying. And then listen to what they would like as far as help or reconciliation or assistance with that, because it's going to be very challenging, and we can be allies, and we can be allies in a way that's helpful versus a way that we just think we should be acting, right? So that's what I see the future holding, is that we're going to have some tough conversations with one and another between, at every level of this, to understand a very violent history on this continent together. We all of our ancestors, were here together. We're trying to learn how to live with that shared history. And we need to do that to move forward. And we need to be able to move forward together. But it's not by glossing over the past. It's by taking a really sincere look at what happened and being able to reconcile to one another and say, okay, that happened. These are the effects you're still dealing with. And let's work together to make sure this never happens again. Let's work together to make sure that there's not another generation of kids like me and most of my cohort that grew up not knowing about this. We need to know about this. That's what I hope the future holds.
Mm-hmm.
The long arc of indigenous history shows that that's going to be sluggish, but that's what I hope, that the momentum is building, and that enough people have been bending that arc toward justice with every breath that they have, that it's going to be something that we can see achieved in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for talking about this very important and very difficult issue. And for helping shed some light on the human element, which is something that I find is always fundamental to the work we do, not just in Ask Historians in general, but people who deal with indigenous issues and people who have to contend with looking at some of the ugliest parts of the history of this continent. There is always some light to be found in there, and it's always important to keep that in mind. So thank you so much for joining me.
Morgan, thank you so much for hosting.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. And we will be linking some stuff on the actual post for this. We will probably also be linking to the original post that we made last year, so people can have access to that as well if you're interested in reading some more about this. And again, thank you very much for joining me, Elle.
Awesome, thank you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.